Good morning, friends. Okay, let us start our topic, which we are to study. So I have used many times the term postmodernism, postmodern urbanism. Today we'll be beginning with that. What is basically this postmodern urbanism? And up till now, what we have done, we will see that what we'll be basically doing will be summing up many of the things which we have studied up till now. So in this topic of post modern urbanism, we'll be studying number of things. For example, we will see that we'll talk about postmodernism or postmodern urbanism in the urban studies, or we'll simply say development of post-modern urbanism in urban studies. And when we'll talk about this development of postmodern urbanism in urban studies, we'll see that the main urban study which have been present, the school of thought is referred to as the Chicago School of Thought. And we will see that from this Chicago School, what has happened in this era of postmodernism, the urban studies has passed on from the Chicago School to Los Angeles School. See, if we go by what has been happening in the past, there is less possibility that directly Chicago School or Los Angeles School would be asked. But if we look into one question which has been asked in the past, they have asked us about American School of Subaerial Denudation. Okay. That means UPSC can ask about the schools as well. And definitely in the urban studies, these are the two major school of thoughts which are present. So we'll see that we ultimately moved on from the Chicago School to the Los Angeles School. And we'll see that Chicago was basically what? Chicago was exemplification of a modern city. As a result of which, the studies which were there, we can simply call them as the modern urbanism studies. But Los Angeles School or Los Angeles was a city which developed differently from the traditional model. And that is why it is referred to as what? It is referred to as the postmodern urban center. So here the studies which were conducted, they famously referred to as the postmodern urban studies. Okay, so we'll see that what has happened here. Then second thing, what we'll be finding, we'll generally here sum up the development of urbanization. So we will see here mainly that how the development of urbanization or urbanization has passed through the pre-modern to modern to ultimately post-modern phases. So distinctively we find that there has been three stages in the process of urbanization: pre-modern, modern and post-modern. Okay, and we will see what were the processes responsible, what was the characteristic of this pre-modern, modern and post-modern urbanization. So once we are done with this, we will move on to more describe, that is the characteristics of post-modern urbanization. The characteristics of the post-modern urbanization. Okay? So here we will talk about number of aspects. We will see what are, for example, what is the characteristic of edge cities, what is your others, like your gated communities, several abhi dekhenge. So several characteristics we'll be talking about, how they are based upon ultimately the idea of post-Fordism, how there is politics of nature taking place in these cities. Okay? So several things like the case of utopian cities. Okay? So we'll talk about number of characteristics of this post-modern urbanization. Very clearly, this phenomena is more, we'll see that it is more perceptible today in the West. But we will see because westernization has expanded as a result of the IT revolution and globalization phenomena. So as a result of which, some of the postmodern characteristics are also finding their way in the large cities of the East. That is the developing world as well. Okay? So these are the three headings under which we will be talking about this main lecture. So if we start with first the postmodern urbanism in urban studies, how it has developed. So traditionally we find that the urban studies have been dominated by what we refer it to as the Chicago school. Chicago school. Okay? And Chicago school basically actually developed in early 20th century. Early 20th century. And in early 20th century, how it developed, here in Chicago, there was development of Department of Sociology. Department of Sociology was opened. Okay? In the, in fact, first decade of the 20th century. Now, as this Department of Sociology was opened, what was very importantly found that several disciples of Max Weber. Max Weber is a very famous sociologist. हमने याद है बात भी किया था, we talked about when we were talking about the theory of secularization. ठीक है? So several disciples of Max Weber, they became part of this sociological department. Later on, two very important people were hired by this Chicago school, and one was Robert Park and other was E.W. Burgess. E.W. Burgess. So these two very important people were hired. Park was basically earlier a reporter. Later he developed interest in the academic fields, and he had very, you can say, worked lots in the southern cities of US, where he had found so many types of problems which were existing in the cities. So he had a very peculiar interest in what the city was and how the city ultimately operated, what were the processes which were operating. Similar type of interest was there also in the Burgess. In Burgess, ultimately both of these met and they formed a type of team, and from here began several type of studies in the urban processes. Okay? And what they developed, what we call it as the factorial ecology. Factorial ecology principle in urban studies. Factorial ecology principle in the urban studies. And what was this factorial ecology principle? Basically, we'll find that both these people were followers of Darwin. They were followers of Darwin. So to explain the urban processes, they basically use the principles of ecology rather than investigating into the process of capitalization or capitalism. Okay? So what they basically did to explain the urbanization process, they used the principles of ecology rather than investigating into the process of capitalism. For example, they saw the economic competition. Present in the market economy as nothing but manifestation of the competition for survival inherent in the Darwinian theory. Okay? So ultimately, that was basically how they began to analyze the urbanization process. We have already seen before also that some examples, other examples also we can give. Like for example, they use the principle of niche to explain the morphology of cities. For example, they use the principle of niche to explain the morphology of cities. Already we have seen before, niche is basically what? It is specialization with respect to functions and habitat. So they basically saw that this type of phenomena was also going on in the cities as well. That there was competition. In the process of competition, collaboration, ultimately what was taking place, there was also development of niches. So ultimately what happened, the CBD became specialized in functional activities, economic functions. While outside this zone lied several residential zones, including the zone 2, which was transition zone, having the slum property. Outside that there was working men houses in the third zone, we have seen already. Outside that there was the middle income housing, and finally there was the rich people living on the outskirts of the city. Okay? So they simply saw it as nothing but the phenomena of competition, the association and the survival forces which were resulting in this type of phenomena. They didn't properly broadly explain this. In fact, much before them, others have also analyzed this phenomena. For example, you must be aware of one name, that is Frederick Engel, an associate of Marx. He had already provided, on the basis of the cities of London or city of London, he had already provided a critique of what the urbanization process was found in case of Britain. And he had already given this type of model where he found that there was centralization of the economic activities, and ultimately outside these zones there was basically exploitation taking place in some of the zones where the poor people were living and rich people were living on the outskirts. Okay, so he had given. But if you talk about this factorial ecology school, ultimately what it did, it didn't analyze it from the aspect of analyzing the capitalism process. It just simply used to the principles of ecology. Very clearly you can understand. याद है हमने एक क्वेश्चन किया था पहले क्लास में, where we talked about Harvey's statement that all sciences are political. याद है? We talked about there is no science or there is no study which is apolitical. Every study is done for certain particular purpose, certain particular objective. So you can see that this was another example of such a scenario where it was tried to be justified the existing pattern. याद है हमने बात किया था, Harvey recognized that this problem, this is the main problem, that the models which are framed, they are just trying to do what? They are just trying to explain what is taking place rather than trying to change what is taking place. Okay? So again, they were just trying to explain through some scientific principles and justify that this phenomena was inevitable. Okay? So ultimately, that was basically the factorial ecology principle which was used. As society developed, you can very clearly understand very important phenomena which occurred was the technological development. So by Second World War, by the Second World War, what we find that there was development of technology, more specifically the extension of transportation, extension of transportation mediums and development of automobiles. Development of automobiles. So already we have seen what it led to. It led to which type of development? Can I say it led to sectoral type of development? So there was sectoral type of development in the cities which was seen. Sectoral type of development which was seen. And very clearly you can understand there was sectoral model which was added in the Chicago School studies. It was also part and parcel of the Chicago School. And in this sectoral model, very clearly you can understand that it was based upon the principle of technological determinism. Technological determinism. Earlier one was which one? It was environmental determinism. The first phase, it was more of environmental determinism, where principles of ecology were used. And here it was more of technological determinism, and it was added in this factorial ecology school. And ultimately, because here it was inevitable with the development of the technology, automobile and the road, the transportation would become cheaper, and this would allow people to ultimately migrate outwards on the outskirts of the city, and the city began to develop along the transportation lines. Another change which very clearly occurred was that we find that particularly later on there was development of services economy. Development of services economy. And we have already seen this led to development of which type of idea? There was multiple nuclei. So this is how ultimately the Chicago School of Urban Studies have developed. Already हमने इसके बारे में देखा है. Now what was found very clearly that 1970 was another juncture, and this 1970 led to certain changes in how the cities were organized, and very importantly manifestation of this was, the biggest manifestation of this was symbol of this became Los Angeles. You can understand before this period the main development center in United States used to be the East, that is the New England region and the Great Lake region, industrial region. But what we find after this period, the development process has very clearly shifted towards west, that is towards the Pacific coast. And in Pacific coast, California has become the symbol. The symbol, in fact you might have heard about this term, the Great American Dream. Okay? So it ultimately became the Great American Dream, where number of changes were taking place, and Los Angeles was developing differently from what has been seen in the traditional industrial cities of America. and this prompted many scholars to undertake several studies which were basing on the city of Los Angeles. In fact, as they further investigated, they found that such type of situations they were developing not only in the city of Los Angeles but in entire America. It was taking place in entire America. Okay, so many of the characteristics we'll talk about, the gated communities, the edge cities, so many of them. We'll see that they were basically taking place everywhere, not only they were limited to Los Angeles. But very clearly, symbolic city was the Los Angeles. And this school, which was very loosely defined school, belonging to scholars from different areas, it began to be referred as the Los Angeles School. ठीक है, सो लिख लेते हैं एक छोटा सा पॉइंट, चेंज द पैराग्राफ. द इकोनॉमिक क्राइसिस ऑफ 1970 saw several changes in how the cities were organized. First off, it was seen that the cities of US had radically differed in their development from the previous industrial cities. First off, it was found that the cities of contemporary period had three principal characteristics. First, they had a series of distinctive cultural practices. Second, the totality of such practices was seen as cultural ensemble of the evolution of capitalistic society. That means it was product of the evolution of capitalism. Capitalism had passed on to another phase. ठीक है, we'll call this phase later on as post-Fordism phase. ब्रैकेट में लिखना चाहते हो तो यहां पर लिख सकते हो, it is post-Fordism phase. Third very important characteristic was that the philosophical and methodological discourse were antagonistic to the percepts of enlightenment thought. ठीक है, so you can understand, इसमें ब्रैकेट में लिखना चाहते हो तो you can write post truth. This phenomena is referred to as the post truth. So post truth is basically what you go beyond what are facts. ठीक है, so it is going beyond what are facts. It is more about what, rather than facts, it was more about perceptions, how people perceive things. ठीक है, what was the enlightenment characteristic? हमने दो पिछले क्लासेस में बात किया है. We saw that enlightenment or the Renaissance period was characterized by the factor of what? Rationality. Rationality was the basic idea, fundamental idea along which it was organized. And that became the main characteristic of the Western society. It was followed, it was given economic angle during the Industrial Revolution, which ultimately became the idea of economic growth. But ultimately it was seen during this period that there were changes in how the things were seen, how the things were taken. And we entered in an era of what we call it as the post-truth. So the discourse was not along what is reality, but it was more along what is perceived reality. Okay? So it radically changed. This type of development has been called as a radical alteration of what was in the past, and this is what we call it as the postmodern urban studies. So likho, such studies have been referred to as the postmodern urban cities, as they represented a radical break from the earlier existing models of urbanization. Full stop. In postmodern cities, the logics of previous urbanisms, have evaporated, and in the absence of single new imperative, multiple forms of rationality or irrationality fill the vacuum. Full stop. आगे लिखो. Such studies were developed on the basis of study of Los Angeles City, particularly the southern Los Angeles. Full stop. Los Angeles was seen as symbolic of the broader socio-geographic transformation taking place within US. Full stop. These studies came to be referred as Los Angeles School. Full stop. Los Angeles School was based upon certain shared theoretical assumptions by a group of scholars who were willing to investigate the socio-geographic structure of the society in the globalized world. Full stop. The focus of Los Angeles School The focus of Los Angeles School was on restructuring, comma, which included deindustrialization, comma, the birth of the information economy, comma, the decline of the nation states, and the rise of Pacific Rim. All these changes have triggered what? The development of this Los Angeles school. So if you remember, you cannot remember, but if you look into what happened last year, 2018 paper it was, and as a part of the 500 classes, I asked one question in the test, and that was edge cities. What do you understand by the term edge cities? That was one of the questions which I asked. Incidentally, in the examination, there was one question which was asked that was differentiate between megalopolis and exopolis. So that was one question which was asked. Now, exopolis is basically what? It is manifestation of these postmodern cities. Edge cities are certain, बाबी देखते हैं, edge cities are certain, you can say, हमने देखा था, याद है, multiple nuclei. So certain functional spaces which are developing on the outskirts of the city. So in present times, functionality is not limited to the center. Functionality is also shifting outwards. So such cities are referred to as the edge cities. So edge cities were the ones which are very common feature of what we call it as the postmodern cities. Exopolis is basically what? It is a postmodern cities. याद है हमने कुछ क्लासिफिकेशंस किए थे, यूपोलिस, पोलिस, ठीक है, so necropolis, all those type of things were there, but those studies were done before this period of 70s and 80s, and thus at that time there was no such phenomena which was seen as the postmodern development. ठीक है, so rather than city passing through the necropolis and all those that we talked about, tyrannopolis, necropolis stages, the cities evolved and adapted, and instead to going to the decay stages, they evolved to further become the postmodern cities, and this was basically represented in the term exopolis. Now when you basically ask that question, it was pretty much clear that the person who is making the paper, he is very much aware of the postmodern school of thought. And this postmodern school of thought is one of the major school of thought, which is the school of thought of the present times, contemporary times. So particularly it developed in 80s, and it has continued to develop in the later stages of 90s. This year you will be finding that again one question on postmodernism was asked, and that was the phenomena of deindustrialization. पूछा गया है? So again, this means that this theme of postmodernism has become what? It has become a very important theme, and can be asked in the human geography part further in future. There are a number of other areas also where postmodernism can be asked. Okay? And one such area we are going to deal with, and that is the postmodern urbanism. Okay? So this is how the studies have passed on from the Chicago school to the Los Angeles school, and these are the two major schools of thought which are present in the urban studies. ठीक है, इतनी बात समझ में आई? Now let us look into the development of urbanism. What we were talking about, it would become more elaborative and explanatory. Now let us talk about the development of urbanism. Or urbanization process. Urbanism or the urbanization process. So we'll see that if we talk about the phenomena of urban process or urbanism, it has passed through three distinctive stages. याद है हमने जब अर्बन ऑर्डर बात किया था तो we briefly discussed these stages. It was the pre-modern, modern and post-modern stages. ठीक है, so these three stages are, so urbanization process has passed through three distinctive stages, and these three distinctive stages are, the first one is the pre-modern, second one is what we call it as the modern phase, and the last one, as we are saying, it is the post-modern phase. So it has passed through the three stages. Let us first talk about the pre-modern stage. Pre-modern stage. So you tell me, can I say the pre-modern stage? If I think about the pre-modern stage was something which was agrarian. The setting was basically what? It was mostly based upon the primary economy. And during this period, can I say the urbanization process would have been very slow? Yaad hai, yesterday we talked about the phenomena of urban curve. And what was that basic idea about the urban curve? That urbanization, along with the demographic transition, there is also taking place the urban transition. So what we find? We find that in the first stage, the urbanization levels are very, very low. And they began to increase. They further increase with faster pace in the third stage. And ultimately in the fourth stage, they stabilize. So this is what we call it as the urban curve. So you tell me, can I say when we are talking about the pre-modern phase, can I say the world including West was in the first stage of the urban transition? It was in the first stage of urban transition. So the cities would be mostly related with what? हमने पढ़ा है इस तरह की cities को. इंडिया में हमने उन cities को क्या बोला था? We said we called them as the bazaar based model cities. ठीक है? So cities during this period were mainly what? They were mainly commercial centers. They were organized around the commercial centers. And these commercial centers, there were some administrative centers as well. One thing was very, very clear in the cities of pre-modern times, their structure would have been something like this. And you can see, it was basically the social hierarchy which ultimately formed the basis of the morphology of the city. So what we find in the central part, there was the elite class of the society which was residing. Definitely it needed some servants, so these servants were also living with them. Around this was the lower class. Lower class were basically the people who were the workers, who were working for these people. They were basically the poorer class. Even poorer class was basically what? It was relegated to the outskirts. Okay? And there were several ethnic occupational districts, means pockets of different type of, like for example, one class of people would form one particular occupation category, people would form their own occupational districts which would be present. Okay? So even there was further segregation, there would have been further segregation. Can I say इसी तरह का मॉडल हमने देखा था कि रूरल मॉर्फोलॉजी ऑफ इंडिया, quite similar type of model. So this was the case of primitive situation. Yesterday we were talking about, if you remember, what is difference between rural and urban? याद है? We were talking about the difference between rural and urban. And one case of difference could have been, we talked about the morphology. But can I say, it is difficult to define, because even some cities we will be finding which would display the morphology of the similar to rural areas. So how you can say that if you talk about rural areas are distinctly different from that of the urban areas? So if you talk about these pre-modern cities, very clearly they had this type of morphology, this system of morphology. And here very clearly what we find, there was more dominance of the social factors. The society was still what? The society was still archaic, rigid. It was not so much free society as we find in the modern times. It was still dominated by some traditional values. And this elite class formed the basis. It was the main governing class, main ruling class. In such a system, it is very clear that money was not given so much of significance during this period. That is the reason, if you talk about this elite class, it was mainly made up of administrators and the religious people rather than the merchants. Merchants were not given so much prominence. And if you relate it with India ka Varna system, can I say we find similar type of system is also present in India? It was also present in the West. Okay, so it was not very much different. So here that these were some of the basic characteristics of this pre-modern society and the pre-modern urbanization. So थोड़ा सा इसके बारे में लिखते हैं. ठीक है, if you want, first you make this diagram of pre-modern urbanization. इसको फटाफट बनाओ. Okay, so let us write few things about this. The cities of the pre-modern period were essentially small scale settlements. Based upon mercantile economy. Based upon the mercantile economy and a rigid social order. Stemming from the tradition of medieval feudalism. Full stop. They varied considerably in structure. Full stop. Despite this variation, Joburg, this name Sjoberg, Joburg has presented an idealized model of the social and geographical structure of the pre-industrial city. Full stop. It is found that the elite class lived in pleasant and exclusive central core while the lower classes and outcasts lived in a surrounding poorly built and garbage filled periphery. Full stop. The elite group mainly consisted of those in control of religious, political, administrative, and social functions of the city. First stop. Merchants, comma, even the wealthy ones, comma, were generally excluded from the elite. Because if you want, you can write in single quotes, a preoccupation with money was seen counter or antagonistic to the religious philosophical value system of the dominant group. Okay, so you can understand the society like the traditional society. That means these cities were mainly what? They were traditional societies, where all the practices, very rigid practices like intermarriage only among the elite class. Okay, all these basically were further strengthening this class division. So it was very strictly what? Class division which was there in the society. So all these practices, all these features were present of the pre-industrial cities. In fact, we can simply say that these pre-modern cities can also be said as the pre-industrial and pre-Fordist cities. So लिख लेते हैं, these pre-modern cities were also or can also be called as pre-industrial and pre-Fordist cities. Full stop. This is because the development of industries in these cities was not centralized and was small scale, scattered in clusters within the city. Like for example, यहाँ पर जिस diagram में हमने क्या देखा है, ethnic और occupational districts. So there were several such clusters of different craftsmen, for example. So someone doing some iron work. So iron work people would be what? They would be found nearby. So there were several type of occupational districts also found here. So it was very scattered. It was not large scale industrialization. Okay? And it was the technology which was used was mainly what? It was primitive technology. आगे लिख लो. The industry was essentially based upon the primitive technology. Based upon the primitive technology. So that is the case of pre-industrial or pre-modern societies. Then came the second stage, and we can simply call the second stage as the growth of modern cities. Modern cities. I'll give you 1 minute to think what could have led to this growth of modern cities. Think, brainstorm in your copies. The growth of modern cities. Okay. My only question is, how many of you could recall the question which we did, that there is intricate relationship between urbanization, industrialization and capitalism? Can I say वही लिखना था यहाँ पर? In this question, we have already discussed this, that how all these three are interrelated to each other. So you can very clearly understand what would have happened somewhere starting with the late 17th and 18th century. What would have begun? There would have been the Industrial Revolution. In fact, in this Industrial Revolution, very importantly, the growth of capitalism would have played the dominant role. And there was one very unique phenomena seen, which was not seen before. And what was the unique phenomena? Yaad hai? We talked about the Taylor scheme. And what was there in the Taylor scheme? How the city ultimately began to get segregated at fast rate. Can I say it was result of the development of factory system? Okay. So during this period, what was seen? There was development of large scale factories. So it was basically what? We entered in the phase of now economic determinism. Okay. And this was basically based around this economic factor. Economic efficiency. Before this, the main aspect was what? हमने already देखा है. There was the idea of renaissance and rationality was the main idea. With Industrial Revolution, what happened? This got mixed with the economy, the money economy. And ultimately it became what? Rationality became the principle of economic rationality. And ultimately you can understand from here the factors like the beginning of the land rent, all those kind of aspects would have risen. And here what we find, the competition for spaces within the city began to rise. Because now the society was becoming organized around what? The market principle, that the capitalistic principle. And in capitalistic principle, you can understand it is based upon what? It is based upon the idea of competition. So competition for spaces began to arise within the city. And very important was the case of land rent. Who could pay the better land rent? And with that, you tell me, can I say further reorganization of the city structure would have started? And याद है हमने ये diagram देखा था? Ability to pay the land rent, Can I say this principle would have been applied now? The highest ability to pay land rent was that of the CBD activities, and thus they centered or they concentrated where? In the center. It was very clear that the economic functionality, the economic functions, they had economic activities, economic groups, they had better ability to pay the rent. Thus they got concentrated near the center. Outside this zone was the zone of residences. And even within residences, what was found? That there was segregation taking place. Very clearly, this segregation was as a result of rich people choosing not to live in the area which was too congested and polluted. So they out-migrated to the outskirts. And that ultimately started what we call it as the segregation within the residential spaces. So during this period, can I say this type of concentric zone, cities more along that of the concentric zone model developed. In this, you can very clearly understand that there were number of forces which would have extended this phenomena, because this phenomena, it seems, it began in the specifically, it became to dominate when in the early 20th century, when there was seen large scale factory systems which began to rise. In fact, this is the period when the era of Fordism started. Fordism is basically what? It is large scale development of industry at particular place, concentration of activities at particular place on scientific lines. It is based upon the principles of scientific management, and scientific management is based upon the idea of least cost approach. देखा है हमने? You have to earn more profit, you have to reduce the cost. So what you do, you remove unnecessary things which are leading to more cost. ठीक है? So ultimately it began to be organized around the principle of Fordism. ठीक है? पहले इतना लिखते हैं, फिर इसमें आगे बताता हूं. In fact, we will see that this modern phenomena continued for almost 7 decades up till 1970s. It was only in 1970s what we find that it began to change. ठीक है? So लिखते हैं इसको. Early 20th century saw restructuring of the cities owing to the contemporary politico-economic and technological developments. Full stop. The cause of this profound realignment or restructuring, was primarily economic, rooted in the emergence of capitalism, as the dominant means of production and exchange. Dominant means of production and exchange. Full stop. The new system of production, comma, the factory system, comma, created two new social groups. हमने पढ़ा है मार्क्स का थ्योरी. Which were these two new social groups? The capitalists or the industrialists and the working class. So two new social groups, the industrial capitalists and the unskilled factory workers. Full stop. These two groups respectively, these two groups respectively formed the basis of the social structure, and replaced the old order. Full stop. The accumulation of capital by individuals, the accumulation of capital by the individuals not only became morally accepted, not only became morally accepted or acceptable, became morally acceptable, but also the dominant criteria of status and power. Status and power became the material status, became the material status of the people. Full stop. The Renaissance idea of rationality transformed into the Renaissance idea of rationality transformed into economic rationality following the Industrial Revolution. Full stop. Thus, the society got organized. The society got organized along the market, organized along the market mechanism. Along the market mechanism, which was based on the principle of which was based upon the principle of perfect competition. Principle of perfect competition. Full stop. Thus, competition for the best and most accessible sites. Competition for the best and the most accessible sites for the new factories and warehouses. For the new factories and warehouses, shops and offices within the city began. Within the city began. Full stop. Depending upon their ability of paying land rent, their ability of paying land rent, the city structure got reorganized. The city structure got reorganized. Okay, so can I say at this point we can make this diagram? We should be making this diagram here. We are talking about this one, this diagram. So on this side is the ability to pay land rent, and here it is the center, and this is the distance from the center. Distance from the center. So you draw these lines, and अभी इसको मैं नीचे करता हूँ. So very clearly you can understand the highest ability is that of the CBD activities, the retail warehouse activities. The problem with them is they cannot be located far away from the center, because as soon as they move away from the center, the accessibility would reduce and their profit margins would be drastically reducing. That is why their curve is so much steep. Okay? They would earn very high profits near the center. Then you can see manufacturing is there. Manufacturing has high ability, but the problem is manufacturing requires more space, and in the center the land rent is very high. So rather than getting located in exactly the center, what will happen? Manufacturing would be located on the outskirt of this center. So हमने देखा है zone 2 was transition zone, where in the inner part of zone 2 there was manufacturing and the outer part was inhabited by slums. Okay? So this area would become the manufacturing zone. Clearly the third ability to pay land rent is residential. Okay? Residential. And residential again would be lying outside this zone. Outside further, the lowest one is that of agriculture. So it would be agriculture. So when you are making this diagram, these lines which are here being drawn, they should be accompanied by this diagram as well. This one. This one I am talking about. This. एक मिनट रुक जाओ. I am talking about this diagram. ठीक है? Now let us write few more things. Social status in this new system. Social status in this new system became synonymous with the ability. In this new system became synonymous with the ability to pay land rent. Ability to pay land rent. This created further segregation in the land use. Full stop. Thus the size and quality of buildings. Size and quality of buildings was positively linked. Was positively linked with price. With price. Full stop. The price with the price. ऐसे मत लिखो. The building which was having low price. The building which was having low price inevitably meant lowest status. Full stop. Such buildings were smaller and ill-developed. Full stop. Since the areas in the center developed high land rent, comma, it became difficult to afford large spacious houses near the center. Full stop. In fact, in these zones, comma, to accommodate the factor of high land rent, comma, high population and room densities. Room density is what? When in one room too many people are living. That is room density. So high population and room density developed. So हमने देखा है zone 2 it is slums. Outside zone 2 it is zone 3 where the home of working men houses. So it is what? It is substandard areas of living. ठीक है? These developed. Owing to the problems associated with the factories which were there in the center, and owing to the rich people tendency to show their affluence, and affluence was associated with what? The amount of material you can hold, bigger houses you can hold. So rich people, what they did, they migrated to the outskirts. ठीक है? So इसको भी लिख लेते हैं. Owing to the problems of congestion and pollution associated with the presence of factories in the center. Owing to the problems of congestion and pollution associated with presence of factories in the center, combined with the rich class tendency, to show its affluence, and status, comma, there was migration of the rich population to the outskirts, of the city. Full stop. This created further differentiation. In the residential zones of the city. Okay, so this is one feature which was there. Now, very important thing was that here this change was also triggered by one more principle which had emerged, and this was the economic principle of Fordism principle. And if we talk about Fordism principle, as we said, it was based upon the idea of least cost approach. And what was the basic idea of Fordism? It was to ultimately ensure, पहले भी इसको देखा हमने, Fordism is something like this. So if I talk about here, it is the city boundary. Here it is the country boundary, and this is the world boundary. Okay. So what was happening during this period? It was found that where in the city there were headquarters, manufacturing also got concentrated in the same area. So what you do, you concentrate all the activities in the same region. This would ultimately lead to what? This would ultimately lead to reduction in the costs, and that was the primary way in which the profits could be earned. Okay, so all the unnecessary expenditure was to be reduced. Okay, so again, छोटा सा example पहले भी दिया था. In a way, guidance is doing what? Unnecessary expenditure. Our office is somewhere else, and classroom is somewhere else. So again, this means what? This means that we have to keep more staff. There are a number of things the facilities which can be shared, but they have to be duplicated. So again, it is leading to what? It is leading to more cost. Okay? So similar kind of phenomena was tried to be avoided by concentrating all the activities at one place, and very clearly it was near the center. Okay? So that was the basic idea of Fordism. So लिख लेते हैं इसको, change the paragraph. Such a change was also triggered. Such a change was also triggered by the development of the idea of Fordism. Full stop. Fordism became the key concept around which the cities organized themselves from 1920s to mid 1970s. Full stop. Fordism was a way of working and organizing industry through the factory system. Full stop. It was based upon the principle of least cost approach, whereby by locating and concentrating the industrial activities at a place, and following the principles of scientific management, all unnecessary expenditure was to be cut, thereby increasing the profits. Okay? So this principle became the main principle of organizing the industry, and that had direct implication with the development of cities. Okay? So this led to the evolution. Now one very important juncture here was Fordism should have been disrupted in the 1930s. So if you are aware, you must be aware that 1930s was a period of Great Depression. पढ़ा है Great Depression के बारे में? So during this period, the world saw an economic crisis, a very big economic crisis. And by this economic crisis, what should have happened? The principle of Fordism should have been discarded. But it was further extended in the phenomena of, through the idea which developed, and this was the Keynesism. It was John Maynard Keynes who gave his theory of production. So it got mixed with the Keynes theory, and ultimately it was able to extend up till 1970s. ठीक है? So देखो Keynes का basically theory क्या था? He came up with the problem why there was this depression in 1930s. Because before this, the classical economy view ultimately believed, or the classical capitalistic view, it believed that in the capitalistic society there would be invisible hand of the market which would take care of all the problems, and thus in a capitalistic society where there is perfect competition, there would not be any problem which would be arising. But 1930s allayed this, or 1930s directly challenged this idea. There was Great Depression. Thus Keynes came up with the idea what was the main problem. The main problem was that ultimately the production which is taking place, it is going as salaries to the people. Now from those salaries, from the income, there was saving. It was found that not all the saving was invested, and thus what was happening? Less money was going in the production, and ultimately that was making this crisis. So ultimately what will happen? A society would be passing from phases of economic boom to ultimately the phases of depression. So that was actually led to depression. So Keynes suggested that in a society, in a capitalistic society, it was also required that government should be regulating many of the phenomena which are taking place. Okay? Government should also be involved in regulation of many of the phenomena which are occurring. In fact, when this situation of depression would come, then government should be doing what? Government should heavily invest in the economy. And by investing in the economy, what it would again do? It would create necessary demand in the economy. And ultimately, through that what will happen? Again, the resurgence of the economy can be seen. But the process will continue. The economy in capitalistic society is always in these phases of economic boom and depressions. Okay? So that was the basic idea which was put forward by Keynes. Can I say the Western world adopted this idea? Very clearly they adopted this idea, and this meant that there was large scale investment which was done by the government. And you tell me who would have benefited from this system? It would have been very clearly the capitalists. One area chosen for this investment, it was very clearly the transportation and the urban development. In cities, lots of this investment was done so that lots of jobs are created. So again you can understand, when this investment was being done, can I say it would have led to number of type of changes? One very important change which would have occurred, already it was occurring, that first you can understand, by this time the society had already reached the fourth stage of DTT. That means it had already seen large scale growth. one thing. Second, there was also lots of migration in cities was taking place. Why it was taking place? Because there were lots of jobs. So the city was growing in population. Can I say it was facilitated by creation of these jobs? Plus, there was development of transportation, because one of the area where money was invested was this transportation networks. You tell me, can I say that this would have allowed the city to further expand to the periphery? It would have allowed the city to further expand to the periphery. Okay? So again, initially it was concentric model. This was followed by sectoral model, which ultimately became the multiple nuclei. Okay? So this is how the structure of the city evolved, starting from the early 20th century to up till this 50s and 60s. It became multiple nuclei. ठीक है, पहले इसको लिखते हैं, फिर we'll see what happened further. Change the paragraph. The Great Depression of 1930s. The Great Depression of 1930s should have challenged the Fordism principle. But the interventions made by the Keynesian theory allowed the long boom of Fordism. Full stop. Keynes had argued that government should intervene to regulate the booms and slums that characterize the capitalistic economy. Full stop. In particular, the government should spend in times of recession to create more effective demand, of private goods and services. So what we find, can I say, after the Second World War, US government spent heavily. So लिख लो, thus after the Second World War, the United States government tried to stimulate the economy by making heavy spending in the interstate and intra-urban highway systems. Full stop. These new roads enabled unprecedented number of households to decentralized to decentralize into the surrounding low density suburban areas. Suburban areas. Full stop. This resulted in increasing distance between the home, work and shops. And therefore greatly boosted the automobile industry along with the construction industry. Full stop. David Harvey has highlighted the role of real estate agents in this sprawl of the city. Okay? So overall, that is basically how the city developed. So as the city developed, it developed from concentric to sectoral to even multiple nuclei. Okay? So that was the case of modern cities. Eventuality of Fordism. Come again, I couldn't understand your question. Then we would have seen probably new modes of production would have evolved much early. Okay, we'll see. We are going to talk about 1970s. There was economic crisis again. Okay, and here what we find that there was no such solution which was present. Thus, the whole economy had to be again reorganized in a different manner. There was we will be finding more decentralization. Fordism was about centralization. Okay? So there was a reversal of approach which was seen after 1970s. Okay? And this is what we call it as the post-Fordism. Probably if there was no intervention, it would have happened even before. Okay? So that is basically the case of the modern cities. That is how the modern cities have evolved over a period of time. ठीक है, एक और लाइन लास्ट में एक लाइन लिख लेते हैं. The physical sprawl of the city followed the sequence of concentric zones through sectoral to ultimately that of multiple nuclei. Through sectoral to ultimately that of multiple nuclei. Full stop. Thus in modern cities, CBD retained its significance. Okay? So that was the second phase. Now moving on to the third phase.